Welcome back to Cycling on Box. We have a sunny morning here in the Isle of Wight, and today we're going to be looking at the Specialized Aethos. And the question is, how does it ride? What does it feel like? What's it like on the climbs? What's it like on the flats? Of course, this is an ultralight bike. We're going to get onto the weight section a little bit later in the video. If you haven't watched any of these review videos before, we're basically just going on feel, what the bike feels like to ride, so you can get a better sensation of what it's actually like to own the bike. I do have a very important question about this bike, and the question is, why buy this bike? Obviously, I'm going to ride it now to see if it is still worth buying, but realistically, at the moment, in my mind, before I've ridden it, just get an SLH. You get a bike that's nearly as light, but is way more aerodynamic than this thing. I mean, you've got the cables hanging out the front, round tube shapes. Before I get any deeper as well, the bottom half of this bike, so everything from this section here down to there is an SL8. So everything else in the SL8 is different, but the SL8 stole the bottom bracket section from about halfway down the tube here to this section here. So yeah, this is obviously the same price as an SL8, but let's see if it rides as well. Let's find out. I'm going to be going over my usual categories. You can use the chapters below, so feel free if you want to skip to any of those chapters. When we talk about the handling of this thing, it's very much, if you've ridden a Specialized before, it's very Specialized. It's just very nimble and agile, and every single time you're going around the corner, if you want to push harder or lean further, the bike just seems to handle it no problem. So very standard Specialized, but it's solid and you can't go wrong with it. And I'm confident that no matter who jumps on this bike, there's no learning curve to the handling. You'll just jump straight on and get cracking. I want to describe the handling a little bit further, and the way I want to describe it is as if it's like a Ferrari. The action of the steering and how easy it is to steer this bike, it's very light. It's very easy to do what you want to do on the bike here, but it's also has a lot of feedback to it. So you almost have like a sixth sense of where the grip is on this bike and how far you're leant over. There's feedback coming through the bike into your bum and your hands, and yeah, you just feel like you know where you can put this bike. If I had to pick out one negative though on the handling, is that I feel like I'm higher up on this bike. My centre of mass or my centre of gravity is higher, and I personally prefer the lower centre of gravity of a road bike or a race bike anyway. That just feels like you're lower to the ground. I feel like my body is more tipped over on this bike. It's not a bad thing because there's so much feedback and handling quality from the bike, but it's just something that I personally prefer a little bit less. You do have lots of high-speed stability go around the corners on the Aethos here, and I think that's quite testament to a decent frame, because I know a lot of very light bikes can feel quite unstable or maybe even twitchy around some of the corners. But this doesn't. Around those high-speed bends, just feels stable and locked in. Well, I always wait to talk about the comfort until the very end of the ride, and I've got to say, I am impressed with this thing. I do think that this is more comfortable than every race bike that I've tested so far, including the SL8. It just feels like it smooths out those bumps a little bit better. When you hit those hard, like English potholes that we've got here, just seems to absorb it better. There's less vibration through the bum, there's less vibration through the hands. So yeah, I was actually really impressed with the comfort on this thing. I've come off feeling pretty damn fresh, not in terms of my legs, but in terms of, do I feel like I've been vibrated around a lot? And the answer is no. The rest of my body feels great. So props to this thing in terms of comfort. Whilst we're here in these nice windy sections, you can see my hair going everywhere. Talking about the side winds and crosswinds, I mean, they're very shallow wheels on this bike, like really shallow. Tube shape's very circular, to be honest. Wind has no impact on this bike. I'm quite a big heavy guy at 85 kilos. Yeah, wind just does nothing to it, so side winds, good. Let's chat about the flats and the rolling on this thing, and I've got to say, it just cruises along like a normal bike, to be honest. Nothing crazy. One thing I will say is it does not feel like an aero bike. When you get to the rolling bit, it does roll up the other sides quite nicely just because it's very light and you can just pump energy into the bike itself. But it doesn't feel like it cruises over the flats and the rolling bits. And one thing I will say is, when you get yourself up to speed, say about 40-ish k's an hour, you can feel like there's more drag on the bike. And you just feel like you're pumping in more work and more energy, and you're trying to hold a lower position just to go the same speed as you would on a much more aero bike nowadays. It kind of feels like maybe one side of your brake is dragging just a tiny, tiny bit. But when you get up to those speeds, you do notice that it is less aero. Well, whilst we're up here, so I'd talk about the climbing. And what do you expect from this thing? I mean, it climbs incredibly well. It is devilishly energetic, and that is both in the saddle and out the saddle. Some bikes feel different when you're in it, and some feel different when you're out it, but no, this one's the same. It's just got pure energy everywhere you go on the climb. And to be quite honest, it is the best climbing bike I've been on so far. Is it better than the SL8? I would say yeah, it's like 5% better, purely just because it feels a bit lighter underneath the body. When I've spoken about other bikes when it comes to climbing and putting the power down, I've used the word propulsive, and this bike has that as well, for sure. Every pedal stroke you put in just feels like the bike moves forwards because of it. It doesn't matter where you put your energy, the bike goes forwards, and that's the same without the saddle. I can spend a lot of time out the saddle here just because it doesn't feel like it takes much energy. Now, is that to do with the frame weight or the design of the carbon layup and how energy moves through the bike? I don't know. Maybe it's down to the rear wheel because these are lightweight wheels, so it feels much better. But man, everything you do on this thing, it just moves forward and faster up the hill. We've just been doing some really steep kickers, and I gotta say, this bike gives you the option whether you want to be in or out of the saddle. Some bikes, I feel like it's an absolute necessity to get out and push when it gets really steep. But this bike, you can just sit in the saddle and carry on pushing, or if you want to go faster, then you get out of the saddle and start pumping. It's nice to have the option. Well, I teased you at the start of the video about the weight of this thing, and obviously when it's underneath you, it's just a feather. It feels like it's barely there. It's just, I hate to use the cliche, but it feels like it's at one with you. It feels like it's part of you when it's underneath you and you're climbing in this thing. I've been so impressed with the way that it climbs. So yeah, it feels like an absolute feather underneath your body. I think part of that is the ultra lightweight wheels. These are the Roval Alpinist CLX. I'm going to put the weight up on screen, but this is a size 58 and it comes in at 6.59 or 58 kilos, and that is with pedals and with a Garmin mount at the front. And to be honest, this bike's got a few things that I don't like on it that I'm about to show you, where you could definitely cut a lot more weight. So the first thing is Busar inner tubes. I mean, you could save 140 grams straight there. The next thing is these bottle cages. They suck, and they're probably pretty heavy. You can get like 19 gram bottle cages for like 16 pounds. So definitely you can save some weight there. This thing, don't even talk to me about this thing, hate it. And finally, we've had to put a normal Garmin mount on here because the front bolt has sheared off and it's got stuck in there, and the owner doesn't want to drill it out because obviously that's their bars. Then the final rant on the weight thing here, and this is a Specialized thing that really grinds my gears. This bike is stocked with a 44 wide bar, or 440. That is absolutely ridiculous. Look, it's like driving a bus, man. No one in the world, unless you're a giant, would need a 44 wide bar. So not only could you save weight by having a narrower bar, it'd also make more people more comfortable on the bike. Come on, Specialized. Stop stocking these ridiculous handlebars. Sprinting on this thing is rather unique because the bike is so light and whatever energy you put into it does go forwards into movement. But one thing I will say is, as you're absolutely pushing the power down as hard as you can, it feels like the rear wheel wants to lift off the ground as you're pushing really hard. And in some ways that's very similar to the SL8, and you would expect it because it does have the same bottom bracket area. So very unique, but because it has that energy and that progression in speed and movement and power, it does feel good still. And I feel like most climbing bikes feel really good when you're out the saddle and pushing the power down as hard as you can. When I get into the shop window factor, you know, does it look cool? Do you check out your bike as you ride past it in the shop window? Does this bike have it? And I think the answer has to be maybe. So let me explain. For me, I don't really like the cables out front there. It's not a very attractive look. Also, the style is very traditional a bike aesthetic, you know, it's got more rounded shapes and stuff, and some people really love the way that that looks. Me personally, I prefer a racier looking bike, and that's just a personal preference thing. But with all that being said, this thing, I've been riding with about 35 people here around the Isle of Wight today, and it has garnered hell of a lot of attention, this thing. People want to pick it up, people want to look at it, and so it's obviously in some ways, because it's of its own unique aesthetic and design and the way that it's built, people like it. People like to look at it, people like to talk about it. So I mean, does it have cool factor? Yes. Just in a very different way to what you're used to. You know, not like the more like deep shaped aero bikes that most people find really cool. It just grabs attention in another way. One thing I will give the Aethos line is, I think Specialized are usually very safe and I would say boring with their design and their paint jobs. But with the Aethos, they've pushed the boat out a little bit, especially with this one with its kind of like brushed aluminium look. I assume the paint is also a lot lighter on this design as well, which is probably why it's on there, but it also is very unique looking. And I think even down the range, they've got some quite good looking paint jobs on this range. Much better than some of the other bikes that they've had. So what do I think of this thing? To conclude, I genuinely really loved it. When it's underneath you, it feels like there's almost no bike there. You're the limiting factor that sits on top of this thing. And that's to a greater extent than anything else I've ever ridden. Especially, well, obviously going up the hills is what I'm talking about here. It's just light and it's just agile and it just moves and it just does everything you want it to do. But at the start of this video, I said to you, would I buy this over an SL8? Or, you know, is there any point to this anymore? And the answer is no. I think that this thing it's very cool, it's very beautiful, but it's kind of the last hurrah. I mean, if it was released today, it's a completely pointless bike, to be honest, because the SLA is so light. And to be honest, there's so many other racing bikes out there that are almost as light. And I think when you get to the aerodynamics of things, this thing does feel slow. It feels like I said, it just feels like you've always got a slight bit of brake rub going on when you're on it. Just at those speeds when you're at like 40 k's an hour and things like that. And that's the limiting factor on this thing. So I think it's really what it is, the last hurrah. And it was bought out like 3 years ago. The last hurrah of like the old school classic lightweight bikes. But things have moved on. Bikes have become more well-rounded. And this thing does 9 out of 10 things amazingly, but it's missing one of the most important components for me, which is aerodynamics. I'm a bit of a time trial nerd, and I think it's important for most people nowadays anyway. Anyway guys, if you've ridden this bike, let me know what you think, and would you buy one yourself in 2024? I've been Jason, this has been Cycling Unboxed. See you in another video.